All right, go ahead.
Okay. Ladies and gentlemen, esteemed judges, and honorable opponents, today we stand before you to discuss a pressing issue that affects our society, the death penalty for sex offenders in California. The prevalence of heinous sex crimes continues to devastate families and communities. Advocating for the death penalty in these cases is not only a matter of justice, but also a measure to protect our society and deter potential offenders. We believe that the death penalty serves as a necessary and just response to the most egregious violations of human rights. My first argument: studies indicate that the death penalty can act as a deterrent to crime. According to a study by the National Academy of Sciences, the presence of the death penalty has a measurable impact on reducing violent crime rates. When potential offenders recognize that the ultimate consequence of their actions could be death, they may think twice before committing such heinous acts. My second argument: justice for victims and their families. Sex offenders often inflict irreparable harm on their victims, leaving psychological and physical scars that last a lifetime. The death penalty serves as a form of justice, acknowledging the suffering endured by the victims and their families. A report by the Bureau of Justice Statistics found that nearly 25% of sexual assault victims experience post traumatic stress disorder or PTSD, illustrating the long term impact of these crimes. Justice must be served for those who have suffered so deeply. My third argument: sex offenders have some of the highest recidivism rates of any criminal group. The U.S. Department of Justice reports that approximately 5.3% of released sex offenders were rearrested for a new sex crime within 3 years. This alarming statistic highlights the need for a different approach. The death penalty could help ensure that the most dangerous offenders do not re-enter society and continue to perpetrate their crimes. My fourth argument: public support for the death penalty in sex offense cases. Public sentiment in California reflects a desire for tougher penalties for sex offenders. According to a poll conducted by the California Statewide Survey in 2020, nearly 60% of residents expressed support for the death penalty in cases of extreme sexual offense. This demonstrates a clear call from the community for strong measures to protect citizens and hold offenders accountable. In conclusion, we urge California to support the death penalty for sex offenders. It serves as a deterrent, provides justice for victims, addresses recidivism, and aligns with public sentiment. By implementing such measures, we can protect our communities and send a clear message to these heinous crimes and that they will not be tolerated. Thank you.
Um, I think Jason's next, right?
Yeah, sorry. Hey, so, in contrast to those that are for the death penalty, I will be representing those that are against it. For what is the effectiveness of the death penalty here in California? Is it working in other parts of the world? Can we trust that the person being killed is not an innocent man or woman? Or are they a victim of racial bias? And can the death penalty be a moral application? Or is it just another form of torture? For some, these questions For some of these questions, there is simply no evidence whether the death penalty for sex offenders is even working. An article done by Amnesty International titled Death Penalty, the Ultimate Punishment, showcases that the death penalty has no unique deterrent effect on any crime around the world. In fact, they even on to state that those who abolished the death penalty had more of an effective decrease in crime after they abolished it. The article states in 2003, in Canada, 27 years after the country abolished the death penalty, the murder rate had fallen by 44% since 1975, when the capital punishment was still enforced. As for my question earlier of if the death penalty has some form of racial bias, an article done by ACLU titled Race and the Death Penalty states that there has been a disproportionate 43% of total executions since 1976. All of these are accounted for by people of color. Even further, the article goes on to state the following. While white victims account for an approximately 1/2 of all murder victims, 80% of all capital cases involve white victims. Furthermore, as of October 2002, 12 people have been executed where the defendant was white and the murder victim was black, compared with 178 black defendants executed for murders with white victims. Finally, is the death penalty morally justified? There is an article done by Claire Andre and Manuel Velasquez titled Capital Punishment, Our Duty or Our Doom, that goes into more detail about the moral obligations of the human race. To quote the authors, the taking of human life is permissible only if it is a necessary condition to achieving the greatest balance of good over evil for everyone involved. Given the value we place on life and our obligation to exist, which would accomplish the same goal, we are duty-bound to reject the death penalty in favor of a less severe alternative. So no, ladies and gentlemen and fellow debaters, the death penalty is not morally justified when there are clear alternatives that serve as a better deterrent. Thank you.
Okay, does anybody want to cross-examination? If not, then Selena Condona.
As Ralph explained the pros of legalizing the death penalty for sex offenders, sexual predators have gone years without proper punishment. It is time to change that law. Many Californians agree. The average sentence for offenders convicted of abuse sexual contact is 60 months, and the average sentence for offenders convicted of statutory rape is 43 months, not including good behavior leave. In America, every 68 seconds, someone is sexually assaulted. As of 1998, an estimated 17.7 million women and 2.78 million men had been victims of attempted or completed rape. That out of 10 victims are male, and 1 out of 6 women are rape victims. That is a terrifying estimate. How many years will pass for rape victims to reach 1 billion in the United States? Not long. In 2021-2022, only 1,378 out of the 70,330 rapes reported to the police led to a conviction, which is a conviction rate of less than 2%. That means these sexual predators are in the streets. No one is safe. As Ralph explained, sex offenders have some of the highest recidivism rates of criminal group. They keep repeating these heinous crimes. Most sexual offenders have more than one victim, causing blunt force trauma to the victims, including death. The percentage of the victims that sustain injuries goes as following. 70% have no obvious injuries, 24% have minor injuries, and up to 5% have major non-genital injuries. The death penalty is now being passed in other states like Florida. In April 2023, the Florida legislature passed a bill allowing the death penalty for sexual battery of a child under 12. In May 2023, Governor DeSantis signed a legislative that expands death penalty eligibility to those convicted of sex crimes. The most serious crimes, like sexual battery of a child, needs to be in the most serious punishment, and the most serious penalty, and the most serious deterrent. Sexual violence leads to a lifetime of torture for the victim. The likelihood that a person suffers suicidal or depressive thoughts increase after sexual violence. 94% of women who are raped experience post-traumatic stress disorder, 33% who are raped contemplated suicide, and 13% of those women who were raped attempted suicide. Studies have shown people who have been sexually assaulted or victims are more likely to use drugs. The main substances used in the consumption of forms such as marijuana, cocaine, alcohol, and other major drugs. Sexual violence has also affected victims relationships with their family, friends, or coworkers, or whoever they're around. Thus, the number of children conceived from rape each year in the United States might range from 7,750 to 12,500. The death penalty is not only a punishment simply because of the crime committed, but to serve justice, to voices who cannot stand up or speak for themselves. Most victims not only have their dignity stolen, but have been shared across the internet for the world to see.
Yeah.
The tragedy is that the dark web has been this door for sex offenders not only to find victims, but to share among each other what they have done to these victims. There is no stop to these predators. Studies have shown that many sex offenders are unlikely to feel remorse or guilt for their behavior. So why should the public feel any remorse to sentence them to death? Not only death penalty will reduce the number of rape victims, but can help reduce sex trafficking. Sex trafficking has linkages to sex crimes. Has made up to 8,000 criminal arrests since 2003. Each year, millions of children fall prey to these sexual predators. Experts estimate that 1 in every 5 girls and 1 out of 10 boys in the United States will be sexually exploited before they reach adulthood. These crimes need to be stopped. No further comments. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Isaac De Los Reyes, and I will be doing the con rebuttal. This means that I am in support of giving death penalty to sex offenders. As Jason stated in his opening, there are a lot of questions and concerns when it comes to delivering the death penalty. Things like proving innocence and racial bias are huge factors that need to be addressed. As Ralph had stated, giving sex offenders the death penalty will cause crime rates to lower, like many people would think. But unfortunately, after much research, studies have shown that the death penalty does not effectively lower crime more than life in prison does, which to some, life in prison is better justice than giving someone the death penalty. I say this because there are families of victims of sexual assault that feel like giving someone the death penalty is a good sense of closure for the victim. But others argue that a lengthy and often painful legal process associated with death penalty cases can just add to their suffering and make it worse. In Ralph's opening, he made the claim that the death penalty could help ensure that the most dangerous offenders do not re-enter society and continue to perpetrate their crimes. Although there is a chance that this might be true, life imprisonment without parole can also provide an easier sense of justice because there is a lot of complications of death penalty appeals that can lead to the offender becoming free. Putting someone in jail for life without parole ensures that they will not be able to do anyone else, just like the death penalty does, but it is a much less cruel punishment. Although it may seem like the offender deserves the most cruel punishment, we must be certain that the person 100% did the crime before they are killed. It is well known that in prison, sex offenders are frowned upon by other inmates and are most of the time targeted by these inmates. There is not a specific number or percentage of how many sex offenders are harmed in jail, but we could imagine that that number is high. This adds to my point of a lifetime sentence being enough justice rather than not letting the offender suffer and just ending their life quickly with a death penalty. In prison, these sex offenders are on their own and not protected from anyone. So if someone in prison feels like they want to deliver the justice for the victim by possibly killing an offender, then I feel that this is more suffering for the offender rather than just letting them not suffer due to the death penalty. Lack of evidence is an important factor when it comes to sexual assault cases. So my next point is there are many cases where individuals are falsely accused of committing sexual assault, and forcing the death penalty on someone who is falsely accused is something that cannot be undone, as to where if someone later on is proven to be falsely accused, then they can be released from prison. The rate of falsely accused sexual offenders is 2 to 10%. Although this is a very small percentage, this still proves that there is a chance of ending an innocent person's life. If the percentage of innocent people being falsely accused were to increase after an approval of the death penalty for sex offenders, then I believe that we would have to consider punishment for the accusers like jail, like time in jail, especially if it is done on purpose. What I mean by this is if we pass a law that allows the death penalty to all sex offenders, then we should also have a law that guarantees jail time for someone who accuses someone of committing sexual crimes and the person is later found innocent. Something like 5 years in jail, or if the person that was accused of sexual crime did indeed get the death penalty but was later found innocent, then we should consider the accuser being charged with possible murder. How this may affect the victim is most of the time overlooked. Every victim of sexual assault wants 100% justice, but we seem to never consider how the process of justice affects these victims. To some, to some victims, the thought of someone dying could make their recovery worse and may even cause them to forever be scarred by this unfortunate situation. Selena said that 13% of victims attempt suicide and 33% contemplate suicide, and I believe that these numbers will skyrocket if a victim found out they falsely accused someone and that person is now dead because of this death penalty law. Even if they don't commit suicide, there is a very high chance that these victims will resort to using drugs to try to get over their pain. As for falsely accused individuals, they won't get a second chance at life and won't have an opportunity to recover because they will now be dead. Finally, Ralph and Selena had very great points when it comes to not supporting the death penalty for sex offenders, but the information and facts that I stated should be more than enough to allow you to realize that giving the death penalty to a sex offender is not an ideal way of delivering justice to the victims of sexual assault. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Travis, and I will be closing the pro part of our debate. It is very important to remember what is at stake, which is the safety and protection of our children. Our proposal to support the death penalty for sex offenders in California is not just about punishment, but it's also about ensuring justice and safety for the most vulnerable among us. The reality is that the current system today is failing to provide good enough consequences for those who commit some of the most evil crimes imaginable. Ralph has explained the powerful effect of the death penalty. Many studies suggest that when offenders know that the ultimate punishment awaits them, that they are less likely to commit serious crimes. The fear of execution can prevent these offenders from acting on their violent actions. For the sake of preventing future harm, we must ensure that these individuals face the highest level of accountability. But it's not just about deterrence. Selena talked about the harsh truth about the impacts these crimes have on victims. Sexual abuse isn't something that victims can simply move on from because it's trauma that can last a lifetime. Many survivors experience severe mental health issues like post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. The pain can be really overwhelming that some victims can even contemplate or attempt suicide. By allowing these offenders to avoid severe punishment, we are basically sending a message that this trauma and devastation doesn't really even matter. We should also consider the dangerous reality of criminals committing their crimes again. Studies have shown that sex offenders, mainly those who target children, have a significantly higher rate of reoffending. According to research, about 20% of child sex offenders commit another sexual crime within 10 years, and the longer they live, the higher that risk grows. The only way to eliminate that threat is through the death penalty. Using the death penalty for sex offenders would bring much needed justice and closure to victims and all their families. It is important to measure the toll of these crimes emotionally, but knowing that the perpetrator has been held fully accountable can really help bring a sense of resolution The legal system exists not just to punish, but to also deliver justice for victims. Some critics argue that the death penalty is costly or that the appeal process is lengthy. But while these can be important concerns, we must also recognize the long-term cost of keeping offenders incarcerated for life without parole can actually be much more costly. And at no financial cost can outweigh the value of a child's safety or the peace of mind that to provide for the families when we remove the threat of a predator once and for all. The death penalty for sex offenders is not just a punishment, it is a necessary step to protect our children and society at large. We cannot risk the possibility of these criminals reoffending. We must offer justice to the victims, prevent future harm, and send a clear message that we will not tolerate such heinous crimes. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. My name is Brianna, and I'm going to be doing the con closing, which means I'm against implementing the death penalty in California. My fellow colleagues have expressed some real concerns regarding the death penalty. One main point I'd like to bring up is the lack of evidence section that Isaac had stated. It is a genuine concern that people could be falsely accused and put to death for a crime they may have not even committed. Like Isaac stated, if they're falsely accused and convicted of the crime and put to death for it, there is no undoing what had already been done. For instance, my husband's friend's family member accused another family member of sexually assaulting her so she could seek asylum here in California and get papers because she was an immigrant. So she and her mother hatched that plan in order for the daughter to become a legal citizen and later the mother as well. I know this scenario doesn't specifically involve the death penalty, but just them accusing him of the crime will stick with him forever, and there's no undoing it. Now imagine if the death penalty for sex offenders was instated during that time. He could have been put to death for a crime he did not even commit. Isaac also mentioned that there are different ways we can ensure the victims get justice while the offenders pay for the crimes they committed, such as getting life in prison without the possibility of parole, which is a less harsh punishment. Now, Travis had mentioned that the death penalty is important to ensure our children's safety, which is very understandable. However, we can still ensure our children's safety without putting a person to death, which I previously stated, by putting the offender in jail for the rest of their lives. If they're in jail with no possibilities of getting out, then it automatically protects our children without having to condemn someone to such a horrible fate. I understand that some offenders may also see the death penalty as a way out of paying for their crimes they committed, and it might even persuade them in a sense to do so because once they're caught, they're put to death and don't have to live with the consequences of their actions. However, isn't that more of a reason not to implement the death penalty because you're giving them a way out and not giving them the opportunity to change or live with the consequences of their actions? Travis mentioned that sexual abuse isn't something that a victim could just move on from because the type of trauma lasts a lifetime. If the victim is forced to live with the trauma that was inflicted on them, then the offender should have to live with the consequences of their actions for their lifetime as well. If we implement the death penalty, we're telling perpetrators that they don't have to live with the pain they caused their victims and suffer in ways that they had to. We're giving them, in a sense, the easy way out, if you will. I also want to point out that some sex offenders become one because of trauma they endured when they were children themselves. In fact, BUD, the Sentencing Project 2024, states that individuals who participated in crimes of sexual nature, or CSN for short, have reported substantially higher levels of childhood trauma, such as physical, verbal, and sexual abuse, as well as emotional and physical neglect compared to the general population. It's not an excuse for their behavior by any means, but often their own trauma is overlooked, and instead of focusing on the causes for their actions, we want to condemn them to the worst possible punishments, instead of investing that energy to help them. Help them by getting them counseling to dig deep and find out why they have those urges and are committing those crimes. Let them serve their time while getting the help they need, the help they didn't receive as a child. That child was once a victim themselves, which is something the death penalty would never allow them to do. Selena had mentioned that most offenders keep committing heinous crimes. Ask yourself, why is that? Could it be that they're not getting the help they need to quit reoffending? They need the proper tools and professional help to figure out why it is that they continue to reoffend and deal with those issues so they can change their actions. We are so quick to give up on certain people in society because we don't want to spend the time to help these individuals. Helping them also helps the victims because rather than being put on death row and ultimately put to death, they're forced to live with their actions and deal with the trauma they once endured and ultimately choose to change their actions and live with the guilt of the trauma they inflicted on their victims. In addition, BUD, the Sentencing Project 2024, also mentions that one of the most influential misconceptions is the alleged exceptionally high CSN recidivism rate. The common assumption is that people who commit sexually based offenses are bound to commit them in the future. This misconception has even been incorporated in U.S. Supreme Court decision McCune versus Lyle 2002 and Smith versus Doe 2003. In McCune versus Lyle 2002, Justice Anthony Kennedy wrote of untreated CSN offenders, the recidivism rate has been estimated to be as high as 80%, a frightening and high risk of recidivism. The frightening and high language was then quoted the following year in Smith versus Doe 2003, which upheld Alaska's public sex offense registry. It traces back to an unfounded claim in psychology today and has been used in hundreds of judicial opinions and briefs. This popular phrase, frightening and high, continues to be used to justify long prison sentences, civil commitment, registration and notification, residence restrictions, and other mechanisms to address sexual recidivism. However, sexual recidivism rates are low, and when individuals with these convictions do reoffend, it's typically with a non-CSN crime of sexual nature. In conclusion, you were giving the pros and cons for both sides, all of which were supported and backed up by facts. Before deciding which way you are going to go, ask yourself if you can live with the possibility of putting someone to death that is an innocent person. Can you live without allowing them to be able to one day prove their innocence? Can you live with not helping those former abused kids who didn't know what was normal because they grew up in a abusive house themselves be put to death before getting the help they didn't receive as children? Are you okay with ultimately playing a role as judge, jury, and executioner? Ask yourself if it was your child, family member, friend, or spouse facing the death penalty, would you be okay with it or accept the decision? Would you be able to live with them getting the death penalty? Now, what if they were innocent and facing the death penalty? Would that change your feelings toward the decision in implementing it? Thank you all for being here today, and I want to remind everyone as we consider our choices that today's decisions shapes tomorrow's reality. Thank you.
All right. We should be good, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.